Okay, peace. Welcome back. This is the second part of lesson 2 in this 19 code lecture series. And so, if you haven't watched the first part of that, make sure you go back and check that. If you haven't seen lesson 1 and its parts, watch that. If you haven't watched anything, take your behind back to the beginning and watch the introduction so you know what's going on. Because we about to jump right in here. So when I left you last time, okay, so we were talking about the how everything was basically boiling down to this relationship between the star and crescent as a representation of the child in the womb, and then overall together they represent the earth. And I told you about how the geometric backdrop of that was extending from this eightfold geometry of the octagon. And so I showed you how each of these pentagonal pieces, 5-point pieces, come out. So we got 5 points, like our 5-point star here, and then the other 3, they combine like this. And so you whereas we have 5 here, 5 times 3 is 15. And remember, the 15th letter of the Arabic alphabet, when coordinated with the Meru matrix, its name was Sin. Okay, and so Sin was the other name of the moon god of of Chaldea, where Abraham was from. And so the moon's other name, main name, actually I forget which one was the epithet and which one was the actual name, but then it's Nana. And then I showed you how that was connected to the word father in the Igbo language. So what happens? Why is it that they don't publicly teach that the language of Sumer was, and it was called Shinar in the Bible, which has its own meaning that may not even be talking about a physical location, but that's neither here nor there. But, and we're talking about Shinar, Sumer, where they say the Tower of Babel thing happened. The Tower of Babel is it's Meru Prostara, the whole Pascal's triangle thing. If you understand what I'm talking about by the end of this, of what I'm teaching or whatever, and how I connect those things, and then you go back and you read Genesis 11, where that Tower of Babel story is, you start seeing it follows the same pattern basically. Okay, but anyways, the language disconnect is because you had the Akkadians come in after the fact, and what they did was, see, the Akkadians were Semitic, so they were using the the semantics and the pronunciations from Hebrew, from Semitic languages, and they applied those pronunciations to the cuneiform writing that was being used in Sumer. So they essentially put entirely different sounds matched up with the glyphs or geometries of the original Sumerian writings that they found. And so you get this interesting, I don't want to call it a dissonance, but it is a disconnect in the understanding of researchers and translators who have their own agendas and don't necessarily want that thing to be connected back to Africa, to Igbo, and more specifically Nigeria. Okay, and within that, like I said, so you have the father, who is the moon figure named Nana within that. Now, he is the father of 2 twins. So this star here represents Inanna. So that already lets us know that this I is a prefix, and that is something that's very common in Igbo, Yoruba, just like all that stuff that branched off of Benue Congo languages or whatever. That's a common feature of those too. Okay, and she represents Venus, because remember that whole 5-point geometry that we talked about in the other video was related to the relative orbit of Venus and the Earth. So it is inextricably tied to our 5-point geometry and proportions of our body, that 8:5 proportion. Okay, and so together, all right, so I did say she has twins. So Inanna, her twin brother, is the sun god, who's typically just represented by a circle over there. And his name is Shamash or Utu. Okay, so these are two names. So we've got the concept of the circle, this cipher, and we've got the pentagram. Together, the two of them, they make the pentacle, which is also a symbol of Earth, or better yet, nature. So more correctly, it represents nature. And then when we say nature, we're not just talking about grass and leaves and stuff outside. We're talking about your nature, your character. And then we talked a little bit about the different ways that the word character can be used. Okay, and this same symbolism is used in the Egyptian glyph that represents the duat. So the duat is the realm of the afterlife, but essentially is the same thing as the Akasha in terms of the substance of space. And the reason we know that all of these are conceptually linked is because Inanna, so the glyph that gives us that her name, Inanna, can also be written as Suk. Let me see, Suk, and alternatively Mush. And in the case of Mush specifically, this can mean either face, like the side that is facing you, or it can mean space. So we know that she's talking about space. Now Suk, on the other hand, actually means crown. Okay, so we've got Venus having something to do with the crown, the side facing you, and space. And so Shamash, being this sun, this circle figure, remember the symbol for Ra as a sun analog was this. It was the dot in the middle of the circle. And as I'll get into a little bit more detail later on, this ends up informing the Chinese character for sun, and then moon is just that with an extra little foot on it. So that ends up being moon. Okay, so these two are linked in the Proto-Sinaitic thought, which includes Mesopotamia. So it was all Asiatic. Like it didn't just come out of nowhere, but it was adjusted for the purposes of bureaucracy. So in other words, the different types of bone glyphs and tally-like writing that was being used started to be used more so for like bureaucracy to keep count of things and so on and so forth. So you had this structure that incorporated math into the writing. And then that becomes very important later on for how we're able to, back engineer a lot of this information back to its intention. Okay. And so anyways, if you look at the Duat, so if we look at all these together, we see that it's a complete picture. So we got the point in the middle, the circle outside, and then the 5 points that are connecting that. So this by itself is used to represent Shu. So Shu is one of the first. So it's here. It was a Shu, and I believe it was Tefnut is his twin sister in the Egyptian pantheon. So Atum is the one. So basically, an atom. Atum is the one that comes in through the ether. Has no father, self-created, concept. And he divides into Shu, which is basically air. And then the air element in the ancient world represents communication and is associated with the wood element as well. Whereas Tefnut is considered moisture. Okay. And in the case of Shu, he is the one that both connects heaven and earth, but he's also the one that keeps them from collapsing into each other. So that's telling you right now that communication is the thing that links heaven and earth, but it is also language that causes us to see them as two separate things. Because there's water in the sky, just like it's water on the ground. Like there's no difference between those waters except for the fact that one is denser than the other. So you've had factors of heat and pressure and all of that. So remember in the last video, we were talking about the connection between the square root of 7 and infrared and how that's associated with both heat and sound, where the only thing that's making things seem like they're not the same thing, because if it's all plasma at the end of the day, you have to have differences in pressure, how it's condensed and stuff like that. So the stuff that is more heavily condensed, it occurs to us as solid, whereas the stuff that's not as condensed, it occurs to us as gases. So when you have the separation of the waters of the earth and the waters of heaven in the beginning of Genesis, essentially what it's telling you is that it's the same mechanism of pressure that is causing the difference between those two. See Dope Bay Art in the building. Peace, family. Okay. And then and so this is what's going on inside this name. So you keep seeing this symbol associated with Islam, but this is the breakdown of what's really talking about. It's talking about this relationship between sun, moon, and star. Now, the fascinating thing here is that the other way that you could kind of tell which cultures are related in the long run is that, remember I told you before that when it came to knowledge, wisdom, understanding, we had this saying that knowledge and understanding are alike. So that's to say that the masculine element and the child element are alike in personality, whereas the father element is unmanifest, it's the potential. The mother element is the material, and then the child is the integration of the two. So it basically uses the information of the father and the material of the mother in order to have a self-aware experience. So we all have those three aspects. So your full integrated existence of what we experience of you as a human is what's called the child aspect. So anytime that you hear about the child in the Trinity, it's talking about you. Whatever. Yesterday we wrapped it all up into one story about Jesus 2,000 years ago, but that same story has been told since humans have been on the planet, and it is talking about you. He is a reflection of you. Okay, so anyways, but so that thing where you have the knowledge, understanding are alike. Now, in Sumer, whereas we typically associate the sun with the man and the moon with the woman and all of that, they have that inverted to where the moon is the father and the daughter is essentially the star here. And so if she's like the sun, the sun is a star. So yeah, those two are alike in that regard. But this also points to the Igbo pantheon, where I told you where Anyanwu, the sun, is thought of as being a woman. She's feminine. So we got a feminine sun. Now, interestingly, we also have another popular sun goddess way on the other side of the world in Japan named Amaterasu, who is also depicted as feminine. Now, on the surface, them folks have taught us that there's no possible way that Nigeria could have had anything to do with Japan. And then what ends up happening in the 90s and then again in the 2000s is that they discover this DE male haplogroup, who are the YAP plus carriers. So that's that is a, not just a mutation, but there was an actual microbe that inserted an additional like 300 base pairs of code in our DNA, and this had a profound impact on us being able to have the type of cognitive ability that we have today as human beings. So basically, if there was anybody that was an original man that had that knowledge of self and wasn't just a bunch of upright walking monkeys, it started with this right here. Now, they found D0, so the first of these of the D, in Nigeria, whereas originally they thought this thing happened outside of Africa, and then they just migrated back in. But the vast majority of D ended up in Tibet, Japan, and the Andaman Islanders. And so these are all dark-skinned, very tightly coiled, nappy-haired folks, often short, so they were kind of like pygmies oftentimes. And so just like the pygmies that you see in Central Africa or whatever, you also had those same, that same phenotype at the southern tip of India and in Japan. And that became the indigenous Ainu people over here in Japan. And note the similarity between Ainu and Anu, who is the head deity over here in Sumer. His name meaning sky, heaven. And when we talk about Akash, remember Akash is also atmosphere. And then Akash is also the do what? So it's not simply a being. It is to say that that substrate through which vibration passes through on another dimensional level is itself a being. And that being gets divided up into all of the physicality that you see in this particular perception of reality in 3D or whatever. So when you look at the ancient world, they're not simply talking about, oh, this is a different guy from the guy that you talking about, and blah, 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 zay. What they're saying is that on higher dimensional levels, these forces that we experience in more of a superficial, invisible kind of way, like gravity and whatever else, these are stable cycles that are essentially, conceptually the same thing that you are as a being. The only difference is that the type of being that you are manifests in that 5-point body that you have, whereas the sun, once it comes into 3D, it turns into one of those big old balls. It's too much energy. It's entirely too much energy to be what you are. So you are the best spatial solution for what you are, whereas the sun is the best spatial solution for what it is. But on some level, it still has a consciousness, because we're all derived from the same one consciousness. So if you want to believe in a supreme, universal central God to anything, that's what it is. It's that from which all things come, the source of all things, and we are all part of it. We are all a drop of it, participate in the act of, experiencing it. So anyway, so the D went that way, and then E eventually went into the Horn of Africa, which is where like Ethiopia, Kenya, all that good stuff is over in there. So it went into the Horn, and then from there, it divided into two, and this is E we're talking about here. And then it divided into, let's see, we had E1B, 1A, and E1B, 1B. So this ended up becoming just about everybody in Africa and African Americans. We've all got this E haplogroup. This ended up going to Europe, and so it was in some of the indigenous West Germans and Ashkenazi Jews. So in other words, the vast majority of them folks that call themselves them folks ain't the original folks. These are other tribes that came in from elsewhere and started using that name. And that's most of the conflict that we have going on in the world today with respect to who has the right to this and who is the chosen that and all of that mess. It's coming from the fact that the ones who were connected to that make up a very, very small minority compared to the majority of the people who now live in those locations. Now, even though this makes up virtually all black people on the planet, this E, overall D and E together only make up 15% of the total population on the planet. And so if you know anything about Black Islam, we talk about the 85% who are blind, deaf, and dumb, who don't know the truth of who God is. And then of the remaining 15%, you've got the 10% bloodsuckers of the poor who get rich off of the ignorance of the 85% and feed off of them. And then you've got the 5% poor righteous teachers who try to, bring awareness to the 85. Okay. And so the reason that the 10% are able to do that is because they know the same thing that the 5% know. They've got the information, but instead of them using it to teach, they use it to get rich and fat off of these folks right here. And then people like that. And that's not even something that's isolated to color. You know that you've got 10%ers of all colors. You got 5%ers of all colors. It's a choice. The 85% are just the ones who don't know. Okay. But back to this divergence between Nigeria and Japan. There is an Edo over here in Africa that's more associated with Benin. So the Benin are the descendants of, the Yoruba tribes and stuff in Nigeria and stuff. You got an Edo over here, and then you've got Edo in Japan, and that was one of the original names of Japan. And oddly enough, in both Benin and in Japan, the samurai, they both wear very, very similar armor, which is crazy. That how does that even happen? Unless, of course, they were one thing in one place. So the languages, like once you actually understand how the conversion works, the languages are very similar. The mythology is extremely similar between indigenous Nigerian religion and what's going on in Japan. And what this tells us is that these different locations where the D and the E lineages were distributed all came from a shared area and a shared linguistic group and all of that. Now, the word samurai is suspected to come from a Hebrew word, actually. What the hell are them Japanese folks doing speaking Hebrew? I'll tell you in a moment. And then that instead of the that we're used to, and this means protector, by the way. So samurai is Hebrew for protector. And that's basically what the samurai did for the shogun, for the emperor, whatever else. But this plays back into that same interchange I talked about in the previous video between sin, shin, and wa as the letters were developing. Now, one thing I want to make clear, one of the key differences between Hebrew and Arabic and how they diverge as Sumerian alphabets is that Arabic remained as close as possible to the parent language, the Proto-Semitic language from which they both come. So if you want to have a better idea of how things sounded and what the semantics were, you look at Arabic for the most part. Hebrew has been through ups and downs because it has been forgotten. Like when they were under different types of captivity or whatever else, they were living in Mesopotamia. So by the time they were there, it was Babylon, but Babylon was originally like Acadia, and before that it was Sumer and all this. And so by the time you get down to Neo-Babylon or Neo-Babylonia, this is a period where Nebuchadnezzar, who's in the Bible, where he had put forth great effort to restore the original meanings from the old Sumerian days. So they worked hard to try to remember what the old stuff was. If they had just came over and talked to some Africans, they'd have been all right. But anyways, so they, by the time the Hebrews left captivity, they had to utilize, so Ezra uses Aramaic, which is another one of those that's closely tied to the Proto-Semitic form. Had to use Aramaic in order to help restore the meanings of the letters and the shapes and everything to something closer to their original form. So in that regard, that's how Hebrew made its way back around to being closer to where Arabic is. But for the longest time, they were hard to do. Now, this ain't no racist stuff. This is just straight up history. The Jews that we call Jews, all right, so first and foremost, what makes you Semitic is you speak a Semitic language. So let's just start right there. It had nothing to do with your ethnicity. That's something that's relatively new in society, that they started doing it. Now, Shemitic would mean that you are a descendant of Shem, which they are, but Sumer was also technically. But then when you look at the line, you have the Hamitic people, the Shemitic people, and the Japhetic people. So Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And according to the way that they had the map laid out, you have the whole concept of the curse of Ham. It's not pronounced Ham, but that's how we do it in the West. But it's Ham or Chem. That's where we get Kim. It didn't have, it was not applied to him. It was applied to his son Canaan. So that meant that it didn't have anything to do with his other three sons, who were Cush, Mizraim, and put or foot. Okay, and the people we call the Jews, the descendants of Abraham, the Hebrews, whoever else, they moved into Canaan. So Canaan was the cursed son. And mind you, of those 4 territories of Cush, Mizraim, Canaan, and Put, Canaan is the only one that's not in Africa. All the others are in Africa. And so the only one that was up there, closer, Levant region, all closer to all of that stuff, is where Abraham's folks settled. And so all of their customs, their language, their writing, even their deities, even Yahweh, were all from Canaanite religion. So if what you are is based on what you speak and your faith and all of that right there, by all intents and purposes, the Hebrews or whoever from the part of the Bible that is covered by the Torah, these people were through and through Canaanite in practice. Okay? Canaanite in practice. So this creates a little bit of cognitive dissonance when it comes to the subject of enslavement. Because if the Hebrews of the Bible ended up in servitude to Egypt, which was Mizraim, that meant that they were the ones that were cursed. That was the curse of Canaan. It said it didn't have anything to do with the Shemites or the Yephthite. The curse that Noah supposedly put on his son Ham was that his son Canaan, his descendants would be servants to his brothers. So that meant that they were going to be servants to the people of Mizraim, which is Egypt, of Cush, which was considered both Ethiopia and India. And you could look into how that ended up happening. And then Ethiopia back in those days wasn't just the country; it was that whole region. And then the other brother, Phut, which is basically Libya, but back in those times, Phut was like all of like North and West Africa for the most part. So like Nigeria, all that was part of that too. So in other words, he's basically saying that the Hebrews of that time, if they were in servitude, if they were enslaved, they were enslaved by everybody in Africa. I'm just telling you, that's the, I don't know how they explained it to you, but that's basically what it says. But anyways, so there's a precedent for this is what I'm getting at. All right, so let's get back to what's happening over in Sumer and what's happening with Masta, the place that Abraham learned the science of the sun, moon, and star, and it came to his conclusion about the one controller, the one source of power that is operating all 3 of them. And they all part of one single cycle. Okay. And that Amaterasu thing is important too, because remember we were talking about the 3-legged crow, Yatagarasu. He is the messenger of Amaterasu. So you get this common theme of this sky being a bird being that is the either the messenger or the holder of the knowledge of the sun. Okay, so that common theme. So that's both in Nigeria and in Japan. Okay, so now that gets interesting because his name is actually, so it's written 2 ways. So you got You can write it like D-nana, like that, because that D is that dingia symbol we were talking about before. So D-nana. Or, we put our guy symbol there. His name is also written as Shesh Ki. Okay. Now this is where this gets wild, because remember I told you that's a symbol for the earth. When you have those two together, we talked about how this is related to earth as a concept. So Ki also means earth in Sumerian. And then we got that dot, so it's talking about it's something related to the earth. Now Shesh is a very interesting thing to show up in Nana's name with respect to the moon, because part of the evolution of that, I was talking about that whole Sin versus Shin versus Wa. So in Phoenician, which is the language, it's a Canaanite language that, from which the Semites got, the Jewish folks got their language from. So Wa is, for whatever reason, which we kind of explained through, the transformation as the letter was evolving, that is pronounced Shesh, which is the exact same thing as this right here. So Shesh, and it means 6. So it's the number 6. Okay. So this is basically saying 6 Earth. Now remember, the cube has 6 faces. So for whatever reason, this has something to do with 6. And then in supreme mathematics, 6 is equality, to be equal in everything in all aspects of life. So there's some principle associated with this that is equal in all aspects of life. Now, just to put you on game, I don't know if I was supposed to get into this later, but in Sumerian language, the word moon, spelt like this, means salt. And salt in alchemy represents the physical body. Salt comes in cubes because it's crystal. And as a result, the cube, earth element, all of that, when you get to the Greek stuff, also refers to the physical body. Well, isn't that interesting? In our teachings with regards to the supreme mathematics, we associate the 6 with the physical, with the physicality and being attached to, this physical reality and, the carnal needs of the body and all that. We associate that with 6 as well. And then I told you with the whole Hindu thing, when we're talking about the chakras, 6 of the chakras are in the body, and then the crown is above it. And see, over there, this moon and star is usually depicted like this right here. Why? Because the crescent also doubles as a symbol for horns of a cow or bull or ox. The original hieroglyph, which became the Canaanite shorthand or the Proto-Sinaitic shorthand for the ox. So the whole evolution is, okay, so ox is this thing. It's got its horns, its ears. Okay, it looks like a little cow dude. And he might have longer horns that even curl down like that or whatever. So we got this guy, and then so all of your different glyphs, they tend to look like something like a cow or whatever else, whether you're in Egypt or wherever else. Then, as a shorthand used in the Sinai Peninsula, this becomes something like this. You can see how that could look like that. Ears, horns. That ends up turning a little bit. That becomes the phonetic first letter, which is essentially what becomes the Aleph in Hebrew later on. How did they get from this to this? Initially, it looked more like a K, like it kind of radiates from the side a little bit or whatever. So the original A over there looked kind of like a K. Now it looks something like an N. And then over here, this even kind of looks like a D. So you can see how somebody might fold all those into one thing. And in fact, there is a word. So we were talking about that dingir that basically means God over in, or deity over in, and then I was talking about Anu, so he is that simple. So Dingir Anu. And note that he starts with an A. So in Egypt, the neg, the same rule, and I talk about this in one of my other videos extensively. It means dwarf. And so in the Igbo mythology of where we all come from, it started out with these dwarves who are known also as Eshi, Inshi, all these different words that I went through in this other, description. The original name of one of the original names of Japan that was given by the Chinese was Wa, which also meant dwarf. So we've got this same thing in all these places where these people of this DE haplogroup lineage come from. And so just like I told you how this one letter for the A, which corresponds to Allah, which corresponds to the Master, to the Supreme Being, you also end up with all these different letters that look like it. You get this word, I think it's in Amharic, which is one of the languages that stems from their Proto-Semitic. They have dank, which means the exact same thing as this. So that's how they spell the dwarf. So you get those transformations between G and K. We had the same thing with Yatagarasu and then Karasu for the word crow, and then the neg. Now what ends up happening in Proto-European is that the D gets dropped. So this is a prefix, just like I was talking about over here, how the D could serve as a prefix. And then you just had neg, and then this ends up giving you night, negro, naga, nagar, which is the actual Aramaic word for what became carpenter in the story of Jesus. So he wasn't a carpenter, he was a nagar, which is a creator. And so he basically had a similar, what would you call that? Not just craftsman, but basically the same kind of role that the dwarves are said to have had in these other stories. So it's all talking about the same thing. Now, what does this have to do with this? So we have this whole concept of the unmanifest becoming manifest. So assault, scientifically, and I may or may not talk about this later, I can't remember, but we might as well go ahead and knock it out here. Remember, this is the substrate. So we were talking about this. The Duat, the Akasha is the etheric substrate from which physicality arises. So this isn't physical in the sense of interacting directly with the, this is basically like the vacuum. But that vacuum is full of electrolytes. So electrolytes are essentially more than just, something in your Gatorade. I know that's where you've probably heard the word, but it's basically charged particles. So they have a charge that is either positive or negative. And these are basically gases. So, like, whatever, whether it's oxygen, sodium, chlorine, whatever, like these things are essentially, we interact with them mostly as gases when they have a charge, but then when two of them come together, And then I can't remember which one was the negative and which one was the positive, so I'm just going to erase that. But you have a sodium and a chlorine that are of opposite charge. I believe sodium was the positive and chlorine was the negative. So when they come together, these are basically like two things that are invisible to us. When they get stabilized by neutralizing each other and coming together, we get NaCl, which you would recognize as regular ass table salt. So when it becomes table salt, it crystallizes and we actually have a physical body. That concept is exactly how we come into physicality and how we leave here. So just look at it as you are these charges that when you come together and you're neutralized, you start to form a physical body. You activate that spark within the egg, because your mom has eggs and she isn't just popping out babies everywhere. She has to have neutralization of the charge. So her egg has one charge inside of it, and then your dad, his sperm has a calcium ion in it that upon going into that egg, it neutralizes that charge, and then it activates and it starts to solidify, and then the cells activate and multiply and they eventually turn into you. So the same exact thing that's happening with the fluid of space, the invisible substrate of space, is what happens for you to come into being. It's like we've specialized the process and we've made certain biological mechanisms to make sure that things just aren't popping in and out of reality. That's the point of birth and biology and all of that, to put some limitations on that. But it's the exact same process. So if you understand it on this level right here, you can do a lot more with it. Now let's talk a little bit more about this whole Shesh thing. Because when we were talking about this, remember these were snake fangs. And remember we were talking about Teth. So Teth was the 9th letter. And then that one was based on a snake in a basket. So we've got this thing happening with 6 and 9, which is basically the same number flipped. Had this very interesting relationship in the ancient world. So 9 for us is born. Born is to manifest from mental to physical. Whereas 6 is equality, which is to be equal in all things in all aspects of life. So we've got the physical process by which life goes through its stages from mental to physical. And then we've got to be equal. So something that's happening with every single stage. All right. Let me erase and make some room. Okay. So the funny thing about Shesh is that you've got this figure, a Naga. Remember how I told you the Neg was connected to Naga. So Negro, you are Naga. So they've been calling you a snake and all this other stuff. But that's not what that means. It actually is related to the word naked, because you aren't a hairy ape, so your skin is naked like that of a snake or elephant. So that's why that's used in that way in India, which is why you need to understand both sides of the Kush, the Ethiopian Kush and the Indian Kush, because those are the same folks separated for a long time. Okay, anyways, so Shesh is Shisha. Shisha is the king of the Naga. He is the mount of Vishnu. Remember, Vishnu is the heart. He is called Who Remains, giving him the same meaning as the Arabic letter Ba. And then in Egyptian, the Ba is the part of the soul that remains after you die. That's what the ancestors are. It's that form. Is usually depicted as a bird, and in fact that is actually supposed to be pronounced something closer to bird, and they do not know where the word bird originates. I'm telling you, it originates right there, because they literally used to depict the Ba as like a bird with a human head to represent your spiritual form, your sky form, the part that you assume, the version that you assume when you are in etheric form. So not your physical form, your etheric form. Okay, and who remains, Shisha is called who remains because he represents the primordial vibration that sticks around after the dissolution of the universe. So this is the Akashic record. So if the Akash is the substance, this is the information recorded in said substance. That's what Shisha represents. Okay, and it's associated with the number 6 because that same substance would be equal in all things and all aspects of life. Okay, and the reason this is important and profound is because 6 being Shisha, related to Shisha, it's funny that in Hebrew, the words, the number 7, the word for that is Shiva, which sounds exactly like Shiva from Hindu. So we got 2 Hindu concepts that's related to these numbers. That's not coincidence because the numerals that we use now, the ones we recognize now, were created in collaboration between Hindu and Arabic people. So basically they hooked the technology back up. So the Hindu scriptures and stuff are being, originally they're written in something called Brahmi, which eventually evolved later on down the line into the script they use now called Devanagari. So you got their word Nagar again. So that's the same thing as Jesus' occupation. And then Deva basically means God or deity. Brahmi was created by a combination of Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke. There was some Greek influence in there, and it was maybe one other thing. I can't remember what it was. But case in point is that in each of these cases, you have the Indo-European languages being paired up with the Semitic languages. And ultimately what that does, because they all come from the same original substrate, which them Europeans don't want to admit, if you bring those together and you bring the semantics and the clues and everything else associated with those back together, it gives you an idea of what the original language was that was more closely associated with the vibratory form of the Vedas, the vibratory form of the Quran, the vibratory form of the Torah. So by them figuring out the correct ordering of the numbers, the numerals, and also understanding the concept of the cipher, 0, is something that holds space. It isn't just nothing. It actually holds space. And then back then it was used interchangeably with the dot. So this is how we end up with these concepts of the dot and the circle, whatever else. These deities were coordinated to the numbers. So Shiva, being the supreme being, more or less, in the Hindu thought, it's fascinating that 7 ended up being associated with the supreme being over here too in Black Islam. It's fascinating, right? And then over there in India, specifically in Shaivism, which is the teachings associated with Shiva, they got that saying, Jiva is Shiva, which is to say the divine spark that is in you is the ultimate. It's no different, just that you can only see it from your perspective. So this isn't new concepts that just came up in the 1930s through 1960s over here. This was stuff that had been taught for thousands of years, where they understood that You are the divine having a human experience, and your job is to realize it and be more Christ-like in your behavior. Become more God-like, not ruling or lording over somebody or trying to make them bow down to you, but doing what you're supposed to do. You're the one that provides the information that allows the physical world to operate properly. You maintain order not by forcing it on people. You maintain order by understanding and bringing clarity and bringing understanding between people. Remember, love and understanding are one quality and not two separate things. And in peace is supreme understanding for the benefit of the whole. So we're the peacekeepers, not through passivity, but through clarity. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing. On a weekday, I'm doing this. Because our duty is to bring clarity such that a person can see clearly to what their God-given mission is, the God-given duty is, not what some other person told you what your duty is supposed to be. For the most part, well-intentioned people that are teaching scripture, they're telling you more or less what it looks like as a group, the general idea of what, how you're supposed to be treating each other and so on and so forth. But you have a very specific lesson plan and duty that you chose for yourself while you were in your higher states. Now, this all coming out the 6 is interesting that if we come back here where we began, the digital root of 15, which means to add the digits, equals 6. We said Inanna is associated with Venus, and the proportion of our body with Venus is 67 million 7 million miles from the sun. The sun is her twin brother. So we all talking about the same thing. Remember, I told you knowledge and understanding are alike. That concept is preserved in number 13, the relationship between the 1 and the 3. 6 plus 7 equals 13. In the story of the tribe of Shabazz, it says that the earth that we live, it was originally a single moon that got divided into two, and then that ended up becoming, you had the dry one and the wet one. The wet one is our earth, where we live. And then the dry one became the moon. And then there's scientific evidence that the moon is most likely made from material from the earth that broke off either due to some sort of impact or some would say it was an explosion. And so according to Nation of Islam, it was actually an explosion on the earth itself, caused by us. Long time ago. But when this happened, it said there were 13 tribes. And of those, 12 were destroyed and there was only one. So you have this concept where you'll have, if we have Jesus and he's surrounded by his 12 disciples, which are the hours of a day, hint, hint. I don't even know if I'm counting to. I'm just arbitrarily putting dots. If it's not 12, just imagine it's 12 right now. But then the point is that just like how we had the cube, which we drew is like the hexagon, it had 6 outer points and then it had the one in the middle. We've got these 12 disciples surrounding him, and then he's the 13th man. So basically, if I go around a circle, if I go 360 degrees around the circle, the 361st is a new circle. So it's only the first. So I'm only left with one at that point. So we have the points around, and then we got the point in the center joining all of them. Similarly, we have 13 moon cycles, but we have 12 solar cycles. 12. So we got 12 solar months and then 13 lunar months. Okay, because these are only 28, whereas the solar months are like alternating between like 30 and 31 days and all of this. Now, likewise, there's 12 signs of the zodiac normally, but then there's a 13th called Ophiuchus. And Ophiuchus, the orphan, something like a tomb, who was without father because he was self-created, is essentially the man at the center of all this. He's the one that wrestles the serpent. Okay. This is where all of these different stories are stemming from. Okay. And so because of this, we've got this need to constantly try to figure out, if I add those, constantly try to figure out how to realign those. 2 + 5 is 7. Okay. So this interplay between 6, 7, and 13 is going to be extremely important in a moment. All right. But when you fold up, so it isn't that the other 12 tribes were destroyed. It's to say that they became one tribe, essentially. The inverse is true as well, that one tribe split into the 12. Okay, so it's just saying this whole concept of all of it coming from one principle. So likewise, you have one sun sign in your chart. So if you were born in July, you're probably a Leo. Well, or the beginning of August, you're probably a Leo. But you still have all the other signs in your chart. You are all of it. You're the entire night sky. You're the sun and moon, earth, all of it packed into one being. But it's just that one of those is your personality that you project into the world. And so that is what this is communicating. It's trying to tell you that all of this is within you. These are systems within you and your character. Okay? It's not some religious stuff trying to pull you away from what other stuff you believe. It's just the system of understanding how those energies are distributed within you. Okay, so we've got the serpent Shisha, who was who incarnates as Krishna's brother Balarama. I talked about that in the last. Now, the other thing I didn't bring up when I was talking about those three in the Trimurti, which were Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva, is that they also represent the electron, proton, and neutron, respectively. So Brahma would be the electron, Vishnu would be the proton, and Shiva would be the neutron. And as you know, the proton and the neutron, they hang out together in the nucleus, whereas the electron is very distant from the nucleus, and that is the part that makes up our physical experience, which is why he's the creator in that group. Now, that closeness between the proton and neutron is also exemplified in the relationship between Vishnu and Shiva, whereas I told you that one of Vishnu's female avatars, when they're together, it's Aya and Appa, but and then they have a child called Harapan. But you also have Mohini as a avatar Vishnu, who so the Devas and the Asuras, so the Devas were basically like the gods, and then the Asuras later on became something more like demons in their pantheon, in politics. But what ends up happening is the Devas don't want to share the elixir of immortality, the Amrita, with the demons. So they basically send Vishnu's female avatar Mohini to distract them and create illusion, so that they'd be distracted while they took the Amrit for themselves. And so to this day, the Maya, which is the word that they use for the illusion of our physical reality. So it's essentially just a bunch of vibration and everything else. But because of the way our perception works, we condense it into individual objects and things. Like, we're able to filter through that vibration to have what we perceive as a 3D experience that is separate from whatever happens in the spiritual world or when we die or whatever else. And so that goes to show you Vishnu's association with the heart and his brother's association with the primordial vibration because of our relationship with electromagnetic force and light. It creates this illusion that makes us feel like we're separate. And so this is why Lucifer, whose name means light bearer, is seen as a deceiver. It's because the light gives us the illusion. So you have not, now check this out. You have not ever seen actual white light. Like when they're talking about white, and this is a word that we definitely have to clear up, and it's definitely very relevant to this, is that back in the olden times when it was talking about white with respect to purity, it was talking about clarity. It was not talking about white people. That's something that we invented as a construct later on. And so because of these old scriptures or whatever else and them not having the clarity, they were able to twist that into a thing of white people good, black people bad, we're going to enslave you. But that is not what that was originally. In fact, you have not ever actually experienced white light. You instead experience a composite of the other 7 colors. So it's basically the 7 colors being scattered. So what you call visible light is actually the scattering of the rest of the spectrum. It's actually clear. And so when something is clear against a black backdrop, a space, is black. And so this root bell from which that comes from, meaning to burn and shine or whatever else, somehow this same root ends up giving the original words for black, blue, and white. All colors very relevant to the sky. So you can kind of see how certain things got flip-flop, misconstrued. This is also preserved in the Egyptian word. So I told you before that the moon in particular is associated with silver, in contrast to the gold that's associated with the sun. Now, there's a word in Egyptian, hedge, which means, it can mean silver, but it can also mean to be or become white. It's basically saying light is shining off of the silver, it's reflecting off of the mirror, and then you see the white that comes from it. It can also mean to set off at dawn. So you'll see this concept of the dawn coming up. The dawn, the east. So in other words, these different concepts of shining and whatever else, it's usually talking about the east, because that's where the sun rises in most cases in the ancient world. All right, so we clarified this concept of becoming white. So going from the darkness, the electrolyte, invisible state to becoming visible is how light is essentially born into this realm. And like I said before, Lucifer's name meaning light bearer, you might be interested to find that the original name of Venus, the planet, was Lucifer, because it was, so there's 3 main objects in the early evening sky that can be visible at the same time before the other stars come out. And that is typically the sun as it's going down, You can see the moon visibly in the sky before the sun is going completely down. And then that first star that you normally see is actually Venus. It's light reflecting off of it. So that's basically what it's saying. So light is reflecting off that silver of Venus, and you perceive it as a white light. So all these concepts of Lucifer being a deceiver or stealing light from the sun and all of this right here, that's where that comes from. It is an astronomy lesson. It is not intended to be interpreted as a real struggle between the good and the bad and the blah, 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 blah. It was all an astronomy lesson. Okay. And so because of that association of Lucifer with Venus, when Venus became more commonly associated with the feminine and fertility and all of that stuff, you can see how that same concept of blaming the woman for the fall ended up carrying over to the Adam and Eve story and her interaction with the serpent. But once again, all that is describing is this relationship between 6 and 7, rising above equality, getting tapped into the spiritual understanding to clarify what is actually being said. Okay. So that's just to give you a good foundation for the linguistic twists that have contributed to the vast majority of confusion. Like the thing that would have you be able to see the connection between all of these different cultures and faiths and their shared source basically gets twisted up right within the realm of these linguistic mutations and transformations that I've talked about in this part. And so when we get back for the next part, I will now be able to start building on, give you an idea of what this fourth dimension looks like. What does this container, what does the womb for our 3D reality look like, and in which ways have we been starting to perceive it in the sciences and in math and physics and geometry and so on and so forth. But at the very least, remember that thing I said about 6 and its association with the faces of a cube and what that has to do with Shisha and all of that. And I will see you in the next part, y'all. All right. Peace.